when we look at the, just for your sakes as a context, the degree of instructional systems technology is really an instructional designer's degree that works in both the corporate and the education world to say, what do you want to learn and what type of learner do you have learning that, and how much do you want to know about how well did they do? So we're trying to connect those dots around any learning environment, whether, again, it shows a return on investment in some kind of monetary fashion, or whether it's something that we would measure in a different way in the spiritual world, and the impact of those things for us. So what I'm going to try to bring to you today is a variety of things for you to really give serious consideration to at this time in our history. We're not just at the dawning of the printing press, we're at the dawning of the digital age and what that means to us, and a variety of things to think about there, but also some practical tools to take away. Russ, I didn't talk to anybody about this, but I'm assuming that we're going to distribute this PowerPoint to everybody at some point, so you don't have to madly take notes. And again, it's a digital reality, so there are quite a few links on here that you'll want to take to potentially pursue some things. I also mentioned to Russ that a lot of the resources around this are not things that individual churches might want to venture out on their own, especially if you're a smaller church, and how the school and some of our organizations, certainly the denomination, might in the future provide some of these pieces for individual churches. So how we reconcile that and how we move through that. There's a lot of the things that I'll mention today are quite frankly free, so you can go down that road if you choose to use some of these tools. So when we think about the tools for education and formation and really helping people change, we've got quite a few dynamics. And the first few slides here I'm going to run through pretty quickly, because they're just going to set a context for us. Really, when we talk about 21st century learning, 21st century education, 21st century formation, there's a lot of opportunities out there and a lot of things, a lot of ways that we connect. And if you're one of the people in the crowd right now that's saying to yourself, all this technology, I think it's making us more far apart than it is making us closer. You need to ask that question. We need to deal with that reality. There are some people that are connecting in ways they've never connected before. Thanks, Bob. And some, he owes me that, by the way. And some realities to all this technology that are making things more difficult. But when we look at the context of what's happening here, my biggest concern is that. But what's happening in terms of the world, as well as we're going to talk specifically about some structures under which I can think as a formational person. How do I bring this technology, as I would expect for Russ when he's in the classroom, and for Dr. Skank when he's planning his programs in the seminary, which, by the way, we're proud of the fact that curricularly, I think our seminary is right up there with anybody in terms of how we're delivering that. I want to give you a quote right off the bat when you think about that information itself. Pretty much through the entire history that we've come through in our world, content in a learning environment has been king. It has mattered mostly the stuff that we've talked about. If you think in the educational market, we're actually making a shift, and delivery is becoming king. Because we're doing some really different things in the seminary in terms of how you can engage in that content. Content's everywhere. And quite frankly, if you're a disseminator of content, this is hard for our faculty to deal with this. Being a disseminator of content doesn't make you special, right? There's lots of people that can deliver that content. If you guys ramp this up, ramp it up careful if it comes back on. But, so when we look at, I want to give you a framework of some ways to think about some of these things, and then we'll give you some actual tools. So hopefully those 3 steps will really help us as we motor through this. Some raw statistics for you as we look at where we're at right now in this age. And we've got some pretty amazing things going on in the technology world. Number one, how much content is being created right now, and how quickly is it being created, and in what ways is it being created? There's lots of people writing and publishing lots of stuff. And if you look at that ramp over there in 2013 up to 2015 in terms of what's expected, these are zettabytes of information. There is no shortage of quantity, right? Whatever it is you're talking about, there's lots of people promoting lots of information about that subject, certainly including our spiritual formation. If you look at this one, not only is information ramping up very quickly, the devices themselves are ramping up very quickly. Tons of tablets, smartphones, and all those things are being sold. This is not news to anybody, I realize that. It was interesting, a couple of years ago, just at Christmas time, Indiana Wesleyan, as usually happens around Christmas time, we lose a little bit of enrollment going into January. That's typical. We doubled the number of devices on our network after Christmas. Everybody got a tablet, right? Almost doubled it. And that has continued to happen every year after Christmas. We get more devices on the network and fewer students. They're carrying 2 and 3 devices, some of those students, to class and to the things that we're doing. This is another one that's kind of fascinating. When you think about mobility, in India, they are surpassing their computer Wi-Fi access to the internet with their mobile device internet, access to the internet. Okay? So there's literally more people surfing the web on a mobile device than are surfing on a computer, desktop, laptop, etc. That's significant from a bandwidth delivery, all those kinds of things standpoint. When you look at this in terms of the applications itself, this is another really broad proliferation. When we all got going in the computing world, we basically did the Microsoft thing. I need a Word document, I need a word processor, right? And I used only a limited number of tools. Well, if you look on here, I don't know how to get out of your guys' way, but if you look on here in terms of all the different things that are happening, and I want to bring a couple of these to your attention for a couple of reasons, but these things are growing all except Facebook right now. Facebook's the only social media tool that's actually starting to decline. I talked about this in a class with some freshmen the other day, and they're starting to actually have a little bit of a kickback to the whole Facebook thing. One of the students said, if you're not on my speed dial on my phone, I don't know who you are. I'm done with Facebook. Forget it, right? We're wasting our time over there. It's fake, right? And even the students are starting to figure that out. So at some level, they're seeing the disconnect. The other thing we've had is some of the students, I actually had a freshman girl that said, I realized I was starting to forget how to talk to people. So I closed my laptop and I made myself go to the student center for an hour a day just to talk to somebody. Okay, there's a real mixed bag going on here of what's happening, and we understand that. I want to make one other note about some of these other elements that you might know a little less about. Snapchat. Anybody heard of Snapchat? Yep. Snapchat is an application where, I'm going to pretend this is a phone, it's Dr. Skank, but I have my phone and I snap a picture or my tablet or whatever, and I can choose who to distribute that picture to. That picture lasts only for 15 seconds or something like that after it's sent and they view it. Okay? It is absolutely proliferating with our students in schools right now in the sexting world. They are distributing pictures of themselves naked. Now the advantage they think they have there is this thing, once it's distributed, it doesn't exist anymore. Well, I'm going to tell you that as a digital guy, I know that that exists somewhere, right? It doesn't exist on your tablet, so I can send one to you and you won't see it any longer, but it's sitting somewhere and our students don't get it. They do not understand that. For years, I've asked this question, for instance, of education majors. When you're done and you want to get hired, what's that superintendent going to see when they Google your name? Well, all of a sudden it hits them. That's not good, right? Yeah, it's a really strange dichotomy there that they run into. So, lots of things happening, lots of different types. This is kind of interesting. Note, smartphone on average, you're grabbing that thing 150 times a day. Mostly for what? What are people doing with their smartphone? They're mostly texting. I have a daughter that pumped up over the 6,000 a month texting, right? High school daughter. Now, she had some specific friends that she was working with on that, and we had the conversation a multiple number of ways on why we're talking 6,000. But certainly they're doing a lot of things. Gaming, social media, etc. Notice that people are indeed both doing gaming and music on their phones. For the sake of saying it right here, maybe this is a good place. Do you know that we've just started in Seattle, Washington, a center for internet addictions? You can go and dry out. They only have 2 rules at that center. Do you know what those rules are? I'm going to catch some of you here. You cannot have a media device of any kind for 45 days. And you can't drink coffee. No caffeine. That might beg a few questions around here. Okay, I'll just let that dog lay right there. Okay, Daily number of photos shared. Here's one of the things that's radical about how fast this is changing. You'll notice down there at the end that here's Snapchat. That's the one I just mentioned. There's 2012, and this is half of 2013. You see the size of that bar right there? Unbelievable how fast that's growing in the user community. It's radical. So we talk about this adaptation rates anymore or adoption rates of some of these programs. It is really, here's the other thing that really makes a difference. Notice this is 2005 to 2012. This is the operating systems, not the devices. So Android, people think, well, so many people bought iPhones, it must be that everybody's using an iPhone. Not even close, right? In 2012 right now, Android is the operating system that's in green, whereas the iOS for the iPhones is in red. The hardware and software side are moving unbelievably fast right now. And we're going to try and deal with that as we go through the rest of the presentation, but that's a pretty good graphic of the speed of that change. It's also interesting as we talk about our global ministry and formation here in the U.S. versus in other parts of the world. This is just one example of that when we look at China and the kind of things they're doing with media. So for us, we're still pretty dominantly a TV-oriented society. Part of that reason is well, there's lots of reasons for that. I won't even go into it. But you can see that in China, certainly that's not the case. Their internet use, however, is very high. And on the mobile side, they're quite high compared to what we're doing. So the amount of media that people are consuming and the types of media that people are consuming is changing pretty rapidly as well. But here's an interesting one on the percentage of respondents saying they share everything. We've got some people in some countries like Saudi Arabia and India that share a ton of their personal information online. They just put it all out there. Whereas we tend to be a little more conservative as a group, but I think you would find that that conservative nature lies with the adults that are online are more conservative and our teens are not. They're not necessarily very aware of what they're doing, as we illustrated earlier. Here's another one, again, for the scope of where people are at. Notice this is internet users and how many internet users we have. Certainly double those in every other part of the world of the people in Asia. But watch this next slide. This is kind of interesting. Again, capture that. It's almost double. Here's the saturation rate in Asia. Look how far down it is. Okay? Wow. So we're penetrated most in terms of internet use and offerings, but Asia's way down. They don't even have it for most of their people, and they still double lead the world in that access. So that's pretty profound. Summarize all of that. One of the other dynamics that's really, I think, missed by most of our adults. I'm going to summarize this quote. You can kind of read it as we go. But this is the first generation that is not having technology modeled for them that they are using for the first time. And I use this analogy a lot. All of you, when you learned to drive, you watched your parents drive. You watched them pull in the garage, you watched them put back out, you watched them do a lot of the things that they do. Some of you watched them speed, some of you watched them do some different things, right? And as a kid, I can remember, having a conversation with my dad, especially mom sometimes, about the choices that they made behind the wheel. We talked about it. Then I began to drive. And I made a lot of the same choices, most of the same choices, don't tell, but that my parents made. You know what? Your kids probably didn't see you game. They probably didn't see you look at the clock and go, my goodness, it's 9:30, I'm going to turn this thing off and shut down here and get ready for bed. One of the examples they had of the kids that went to this internet addictions facility was he literally sat for 4 weeks round the clock playing video games. The capacity to disconnect is amazing inside of the internet environment. So what we're shaping in our churches and what we're shaping for us as pastors, if you look at, I got to say this right here, if you look at the statistics of the number of pastors that struggle with pornography, it is depressing. It's really sad. So we've got to take this on ourselves, not only for ourselves, but also for the kids and the people that are around us. But here's the other part of it that's really significant. This generation that's come up with technology is not really begging the question, what is this doing to me while I use it? Is it changing me in some way? Is it debilitating me in some ways? Those kind of dynamics. They're not very introspective around their technology use. that's something we need to encourage and foster for ourselves as well as them. There's a book called The Millennium Matrix that I'm really going to highly recommend to you if you've never heard about it. It's written by a guy named Rex Miller. And it takes communication strategies across all of the centuries, summarizes those, and says this is the impact that these things are making on our cultures and societies. And when I say matrix, at the end of the book, it's got a full matrix across all the different communication eras, back from oral to print to all the way through to digital now. But here's an interesting comment that he makes in the book, is that indeed how we communicate, that medium. So think about even different ways that you see sermons delivered, how people preach in our churches today. Some people are very casual. Some people are, and in fact, casual by the way of, we know there's storytellers and there's all kinds of ways that we communicate that. Some people are still maybe what we'd call fire and brimstone, and we're going to stay right on message and make 3 points here kind of a thing. Those are part of that dynamic as well. But that communication really defines our relationships, culture, and community, and really tells how things are going for us. Another point that he makes in that is that this is the reality that we have to deal with for these students and for not just students. Again, our adults in our current culture are trying to reconcile the fact that we're very interconnected. This is a very complex environment. One of the things that's difficult for us, I don't know if you remember back to where really your only communication tool in your home was the phone that was hanging on the wall. You remember those days? Some of you will remember those days. Some of you, I'm looking around, might even remember before the phone was hanging on the wall. But anyway, no offense. But what I remember those days when my parents could tell me, hey, that's it, get off it and go do something else. You know, I didn't spend a lot of time on the phone, but I remember that they could control it. Trying, again, I mean, as much as we had conversations with our daughter, try to control 6,000 text messages in a month. You know, it's really interesting to try and bring accountability to our young people when that device is small enough for them to take to their room. And quite frankly, some kids, I know kids that sleep with their phone, for goodness sakes. And they'll text in the middle of the night. If they wake up, they'll start texting somebody. And they'll get some responses, too. It's ridiculous. So how fast things are changing, we kind of addressed that, but Miller does a nice job of summarizing these. Intangibility, convergence, immediacy. I mean, who has patience anymore, right? So the technology really drives some things that we have to be aware of, and the unpredictability of it in terms of not only what can come through that media, but certainly where it can lead us and what shows up. And who hasn't had the experience where I'm online and I get an email or even something pops up on my browser as I'm looking at something that is a pretty big surprise. So in light of that reality, and again, I wanted to make that a fairly quick summary of where we're at, how do we create a framework for the ways that we choose to communicate around the different kinds of things that we're doing? And I don't pretend to understand everybody in the room and how you're involved or engaged in ministry and those kinds of things, but I want you to contextualize, obviously, this conversation in your process, whether you're an assistant pastor or a pastor or, you know, again, in any of the options that we might have. Because in terms of what we have right now, there's lots of tools and lots of things that we can do. I do want to offer this little pause, I should say, for concern here, though, and this is just one example. As I've done some research on different kinds of social sites, this is one of them that came up as a collaborative tool. And if you look at that announcement, they were rolling along, they were promoting their site, and then all of a sudden in 2011, they put this announcement on there. You don't know that's coming. Okay, I'm going to give you 2 examples of things that you probably don't know that are coming. One of them is, how many guys have an iTunes account? I realize there's some ladies here too with us, but we've got an iTunes account. What happens to your iTunes account when you die? It's what? It's vaporware. You have not purchased that music. You've rented it. It's non-transferable. It goes nowhere. Right? And back in our day, we thought about owning those 8 tracks. We thought about owning those, records, right? We had something. Anymore, this is the kind of the future of both software and services and those kinds of things. You buy access. That's the way the music industry's gone. We've got a lot of music sites where you just pay a membership fee and you can get as much music as you want to. Spotify and lots of different examples of that. But the idea of ownership and content ownership is really changing rapidly as well. Intellectual property rights, we've had some different initiatives at the university lately that have really brought us into a whole new world of who owns what you think. We've dealt with that from a faculty standpoint. We're dealing with that from a lot of different standpoints. But this happens. It's just a consequence of the times. So when we look at a framework for decision making, and I'm going to run you through a little bit of instructional designer thinking right now, and this really helps us clarify what it is we're trying to achieve. So when we think about education and formation, or we think about bringing that person along, whether it's ourselves, whether it's some of our parishioners, people we're reaching out to, those kinds of things, and how that relates to the ways that we communicate. One of the things that we want to do is hopefully give ourselves a way to think about that process. And one, what's really the result that we want? I had a conversation with a pastor fairly recently that a pretty traditional Wesleyan pastor, I would say, in terms of both his experience and the time he's been in ministry. And I said, so what is it, if I were to ask you, what are you really trying to achieve Sunday morning? I mean, you preach for 20 to 25 minutes. Do you want people to remember a certain thing? Do you want them to change a certain behavior? Do you want them to, I mean, what's really the outcome of that? And it was interesting because he kind of stared at me for a little while and said, what do you mean the outcome of that? I just want to preach. That's what I do. I preach, right? I hope there's a response out there somewhere. And generally what I get is one of two things, and you've probably experienced this. The people that really didn't like it talk to me, and the people that really did like it talk to me. I don't know where that middle is landing. I don't have any response mechanism. Well, okay, would you like a response mechanism? Because technically right now we could easily create that. I don't know how many of you guys have engaged in Twitter, but one of the things that's happening right now, national conferences as speakers go around and speak, and might even be happening in here, I don't know, but you'll have people in the audience and they'll create a Twitter feed for that very session, and they'll start doing Twitter responses to this thing right in the middle of it, and somebody's watching it, and sometimes they'll even complete the loop, and there'll be an earpiece in that speaker's ear saying, you're losing them, or whatever, and he can kind of deviate from his actual, yeah. I mean, it's real-time response-oriented kinds of things. Imagine if your parishioners were sitting there with that. Yeah, get out of 1 John and go to Peter. You know, I don't know what that would look like, but that would be pretty interesting. So what we're talking about is kind of a system, and we certainly do this on the academic side where we have assessments and we try to use those assessments to improve our classes and those kinds of things. The first question we really have to ask, though, is what is it that we're really trying to achieve? So think about any of those ministries. Think about your board. Think about a lot of different places where we could beg that question. What is it I'm trying to achieve with this technology? And the more you can clarify that, the more you can do that. I kind of got into the technology world in the 90s, back when the internet was just starting. I did my doctoral work, at least my coursework, at Indiana University, and they had an amazing statistic at that time. In '96, half of all the education traffic on the internet went through Indiana University. I mean, they were early pioneers in a lot of that movement, and so it was fascinating to be there at that time. But I could tell you a bunch of stories about that, but I won't. But it was definitely interesting to get into the web space and be a web designer developer. And I can't tell you how many times somebody would come to me and say, I want you to build me a website. And I would say, okay, what do you want the website to look like? What do you want it to do? And I'd start asking them questions, and they would say, I don't know, you're the expert, you tell me. Wait, that's not how this goes, right? Any technology needs to answer your outcomes and requirements for what you want it to achieve. So first and foremost, clarify that in your mind, however that looks. Secondly, do some analysis then about the tools that you might use, the people that have elements of that. It's interesting that some of us would say, well, I want to do this. Maybe it's an iOS app. Maybe it's an app for iPhones and iPads. But only 20% of the people in my church have an iPad. Well, that's probably a bad move, right? I mean, those are the kinds of things that we would want to do in that analysis step is really at what's our environment? How many people of that age have that tool, et cetera, that might put pressure on that? Then what does it look like if it's successful? How will I know that if I use that thing and it's actually working, that people might indeed, we would call it a success? Because what? Because when I'm preaching my sermon, everybody's got a tablet and they're all looking down. Well, that would be good. Wait a minute, maybe not. So we want to define those ideas of success and those measures. How would I actually know that? Now we get into the actual details of it. How would I choose a tool? Why would I pick that one over that one? Why that web service over that web service? Why, et cetera, et cetera? But that structure is a really good, that'll give you a lot of clarity around that tool choice. Maybe we tried for our board at Westview, Russ mentioned that I'm at Westview, we tried a web collaborative site, so a meeting collaboration tool online. You know what? I thought it was great. One other board member thought it was great. The rest of them, I don't know that they even logged in, quite frankly. It was kind of funny. They kind of nodded that they would like to try it in the board meeting, but we didn't get too far past that. Then obviously, once you've got that choice, an implementation and evaluation cycle. If we do this, does it work well? Once we get it, do we run into any road bumps with trying to implement that? And then do the evaluation and say, okay, was it worth it? Is it worth it? Is it ongoing worth it? Unfortunately, one of the realities of this cycle is that we're going to be doing it a lot, and change is a dynamic that we're going to really have to embrace. Even the things that we're doing right now, I don't know if you've shopped for a mobile phone lately and gone through that journey and said, okay, what device am I going to use? What vendor am I going to use in terms of the service? Is it going to be Verizon? Is it going to be whatever? That's pretty challenging stuff, especially if you want to be a discriminating buyer of that equipment and of that service. But it's the journey that we're on, and I don't know that there's a way really to get away from that. But if you kind of structure your thinking around it and kind of see a whole cycle and are able to talk about that cycle, the more you can clarify where you want to go at the beginning, the better result I promise you you're going to have. So with all of those things, we do want to kind of structure our thinking around it. In our different kinds of ministries, these are just some that came to my mind, but you can think through a lot of different parts of ministry with that same cycle. You can think through your staff development, your personal development. I'm going to share an iHabit app that we created it as a few faculty and I at Indiana Wesleyan created as kind of an example of this. But there's lots of ways that we can approach that education, that opportunity for people to learn something, as well as that opportunity to measure what they're learning. And so what's happening Sunday mornings? Is there some kind of response mechanism on Wednesday nights, small groups? Accountability and discipleship are important pieces. We're not necessarily connecting those in the church to what is happening in people's lives. And that's a real challenge. For an IT guy like myself, when I go home, I think Dan does the same thing. Getting on my computer is not the next thing I want to do again, right? I've spent a lot of time on my computer already. So some people do the opposite. They haven't had time on their device or their computer and whatever, and for them, an hour or two, it may be fun. How much we want to encourage that, we really want to think about. And then other things that you would think of, I'm sure if we took some time, you could come up with a lot of different ideas around that. So what's happening in terms of the actual tools? We'll move into the tool part of this and say, you know, what's dying? It's interesting, again, different generational levels. What we're finding right now, even at Indiana Wesleyan, a lot of colleges are doing this. They're watching the computing habits of their seniors versus their freshmen. And quite honestly, they're very different. So we talk about generations, and if we talk about the 50s, what's the name of the generation in the 50s? Right? In terms of the U.S., in the 50s, we call them not the boomers, those are the 60s. The greatest generation, right? I think that was Kennedy's term, somebody's term was the greatest generation. Then we had the boomers, and then we had, you know, we could go through that. Those were 10 to 15 year spans of people that were generationally different. And some of you grew up in those times. And I think of, I mean, I was born in '63, and I think of the 60s, the little of it, the tail end of it that I can remember, but the early 70s, some of those were significant events in terms of North American life and those kinds of things. Today, those generations are literally 3 years apart. They're different, right? That's radical reality for them. I have 4 kids. Katie's our oldest. I have to tell you a funny story here. One of our faculty members when Katie was a freshman, Katie was always gifted academically, and her heart was always really good. And so she got into philosophy with Todd Ream. And after her first semester, he came up, no, I think maybe it was second semester, he came up to me and said, Lorne, I just graded Katie's final. She's really, really, I mean, she did really well. I think it was the best paper I've ever graded, and I'm sure she's smarter than you are. Thanks, Todd, I appreciate that. Yeah, there's no doubt about that. But Katie's 24, and then we go down to 14. Connor's 14, and 2 girls in between, Katie and Connor. You know, as I look at our 4 kids, they're 10 years apart. They are very different in how they do their device use and how they relate to their friends and all the different dynamics about that. So does that complicate your world in terms of trying to reach those different audiences? Absolutely it does, right? Absolutely it does. But in terms of the tools that we use, we've thought about for years disseminating information and having static websites, and those worked for a while, and people thought, what a wonderful thing back in the early 2000s. We can put all this information out there. Won't people just come and get it? It's kind of the interesting conversation we have now around MOOCs. Everybody know what a MOOC is? A massive open online course. If we put it out there for free, certainly people will want to do it. And we've started the conversation at Indiana Wesleyan. And immediately some of the faculty say, well, of course we should do my course, because wouldn't people want to take maybe, I'm going to pick on Dr. Skank again, Hebrews, with Dr. Skank. If that was free, everybody would do it, wouldn't they? Well, maybe. So a lot of people would. Some people might not be all that interested, right? So there's that reality that we have to deal with too. But we've also got other systems in place where people feel like I want to be in control. People feel like I have this thing kind of already established. But that's kind of the old way of thinking, quite frankly. And so when we look at the digital tools and the new world, we get into this conversation about apps and how many different kinds of things can be developed in an app. And if you haven't used a smartphone and you haven't, or an iPad or something like that and started into the app world, it's amazing. I want to say that they're up to like 5,000 different apps in the iOS alone, and I think Android's, it's more than that, but it's ridiculous. From weather apps to, whatever. Now the expression goes, there's an app for just about anything. We also asked the question about paperless. Does it do anything to hand anybody, is it any good to hand them a bulletin anymore? Maybe, have you seen the QR codes? The graphic, right, that you can snap on your phone. Maybe outside of church, we just ought to have a QR code every Sunday and have everybody snap that and walk away with their bulletin on their smart device. That day's coming, I think we have to consider that. Everything's online. One of the other issues, though, that we want to look at in terms of the cloud and different program files, the cloud means just storage and bandwidth on the internet that you can access from anywhere as long as you have that connectivity. So we can get that connectivity through a Wi-Fi device. I don't see an access point in here, but I'm guessing maybe that's one over there. Or certainly through your 3G or 4G, right, your telephone environment. So there's two ways to get that access. But what that means is now continually, if I store things in the cloud, that's just a server that's sitting in somebody's room somewhere that's connected to the internet. That's as complicated as the cloud is. But if I store something there, I can get it, access anytime I can get access to the internet. Well, what does that mean to me in terms of I don't have to store it on my device? And in fact, does that mean, which we've created this capability now, you can literally run programs on the cloud. You don't have to have anything on your device. Have you seen a Google tablet? Right? The Google tablet is a small little tablet. I'll use a book to represent it. But essentially, all you've got is Wi-Fi and a dummy terminal. So you got a keyboard and a screen, and you don't actually run any programs on the device itself. You run your programs and your stored documents in the cloud. You access them, work with them, store them back up there, and keep right on going. So the flexibility of that environment is pretty significant in terms of how we might actually deal with information and the different pieces of that. Certainly the mobile computing is significant in terms of how students, and well, again, everybody has access to content and a variety of different things that they can do on that device. That's the kind of the key to the mobile piece, is just how much of my life now can revolve around that mobile dynamic. I don't have to be tied to any specific location, geography, etc., but that's a significant part in how much people are shifting, even in a learning environment. For us, people are answering their discussion threads in their courses. They're doing just about everything, taking quizzes on that mobile device. If it's a smartphone of some type, they're doing that with the mobile device. It sounds, even I still look at that and go, I don't know about that. It seems clunky to me just because I like my bigger screen. But a lot of our students are doing that because they're interacting in class, sitting on the train, going home from work, or whatever, in a ride share where they don't have to pay attention to the road. Some of them are actually trying to do it while they're driving, but that's a little bit of a concern. Then, of course, here's the other piece that's really significant right now, and you notice this if you think back to the slides we had of Snapchat and some of these other areas. Video is kind of the new queen, I'm going to say. Students are communicating a lot with images and video, and YouTube is one that you're familiar with. What's interesting about YouTube is how much time students find themselves spending right now just surfing for anything on YouTube, just watching YouTube videos. And YouTube is kind of interesting how it brings you more videos for every video you watch, right? It's trying to feed the monster. And the amount of advertising and different things that are going on there are significant. One of the pieces that I don't know if you've heard recently, YouTube is literally seriously taking the next step on how to monetize those videos. And they're now starting to talk about memberships, and they're now starting to talk about access, and it's not going to all be wide open free for much longer. And it's a concern for a lot of people that have said, because YouTube's kind of, you know, espoused this policy that you'll always be able to get access to this, it'll always be free. But they can change tomorrow. Facebook made some changes that really upset some people on privacy settings and all those things a few years ago, and kind of had to work their way through that. But those environments are challenging for us, because we've got to take that next step and go, do I want to post, for instance, our sermons on YouTube? I guarantee you, some of you guys here have posted a sermon on YouTube. I've seen pastors' sermons on YouTube. It's a good tool in that regard, and it's pretty easy to do. In terms of ownership, though, once you put it there, you don't own it. You don't have control over it. They can do other things with it. That's part of the contract to use the site. So there is some risk involved in that, and some control that we lose. The rich media, all the other dynamics of, again, the still, the video, all those kinds of other images are important pieces of us understanding how fast that world is changing and what's going on there. So for some of these, you know what? Now, you guys that are running the PowerPoint in the back, do I have a mouse here? Nope. You may want to help me out here. Go back page. Here we go. Click on Teambox. This is a web collaboration tool, and I've got a bunch of them listed here. And again, all of these linked to somewhere. You've probably heard of Google Docs before. Lots of different ways I could potentially connect the administration of any kind of a ministry. And these, depending on the level at which you participate in these things or use them, certain number of users is usually how that goes, it can be free. So we can just leave it right there on that page, and then we'll come back to the PowerPoint in a second. But Teambox basically gives you space, digital space, for all of you to share documents, share communications, etc., to build environments where you could absolutely run, even if you wanted to, a kind of a spiritual formation course, something like that in there. So notice I had, I think, 6 of those listed. Lots of opportunities around there to create some shared dialogue space for anything we might want to work on, whether it's a building project or anything like that. Some of these actually have project planners built right into them. They often have instant messaging, so you could literally have a meeting. Let's go back to the slideshow now for Cameron. That's great. You can set these up. Don't click on that anymore. Well, that'll be enough of an example. But for instance, most of these you can set them up to. If somebody is in the system and sends a message through the system, it can go directly to your email. These can be really good coordination tools for certain kinds of communication environments. So one of the tools that's really becoming more prolific is this kind of web collaboration space. Google Docs even has version controls and those kinds of things. Again, you can set up an email in Gmail, which is connected to Google Docs, that is free and you can utilize and continue to have. So they're each a little bit different in terms of how they do things, but that's one of the kinds of tools that you could conceivably use. Again, one of the things I do want you to think about as you go through this is there are a variety of things that we do that are small, that only require a few of us to attend to, but some of the things I might want to do with my entire church, depending on the size of our church, I want to get everybody included. We might want to even think about something as simple as a book read, and then we're going to have comments about the different chapters and whatever kind of thing like that. You can use this media very effectively for some of those communication strategies. Most of you have heard of Skype. Click on Join Me, if you would, back there. For specific meetings themselves, Join Me is a little bit different. We'll let it come up here because of the different features that meeting includes. So when you start the meeting, let's see, click on the drop-down menu. What is it? Yeah, so and click on Features. when we look at what this does, you can share a screen. So if you had documents there, you could say, okay, everybody that's connected to this meeting is going to look at that document. You can make internet calls. So if you wanted somebody, the audio to be part of that, you can distribute control of the meeting. If somebody wanted to say, okay, I'm going to talk about this part of the document, you talk about that part of the document. It certainly has chat and a variety of options there, along with some other free parts of that. So if you wanted to say, we're going to structure this where we have this scheduled time where we all get together online because we don't want to do the drive, it is interesting to me that at some of our churches, especially the larger churches, people will drive 45 minutes to go to church. Well, then when you try and schedule meetings, it starts to become a little prohibitive. Let's go back. Skype is as you know, more of just a web conferencing tool where we can be both video and audio online together. You can have multiple users. Usually when you get above 4 or 5, it starts to get a little, the transmission isn't very good, the video's not very good, the audio can kind of break up. Web-based creativity, these are kind of interesting. Click on CoSketch. If you want to do some brainstorming with another pastor in another location, some people in another country for that matter, CoSketch is a place where, if you just scroll up a little bit, what you can have is kind of some whiteboard space with some symbols on there that you can literally get together and say, okay, let's noodle this out. Let's start thinking about what our church would look like, and you can do some planning and you can do whatever. It's very graphical, and all the users on the system can add whatever lines, symbols, images, whatever they want to add. So if you were trying to do some kind of different planning, even with maybe somebody that was outside your ministry that was helping you think through something, CoSketch is kind of interesting because it just gives you free space that's online that you can just have at. So here we go back. Twidla is kind of like that too. It's pretty similar to that. Way down at the bottom here, we've got showdocument.com. That one's basically just a web-based screen share. But if you said we had a contract that we wanted to examine, we're working on this project and we want to get a couple people around that contract that were disconnected from each other, you could have that document on there, and it's really specific about that. Transferring big files, if you've ever wondered, how do I get this whole PowerPoint over to somebody when I've got these limitations to our file distribution in terms of the size of the file or maybe some large pictures or whatever. Transfer big files is simply an internet service, and we won't go there, where you can upload a big file, give somebody else access to it, and they can download it onto their machine so it doesn't have to be transferred through email. Small service like that is something that's significant. In terms of the cloud storage, you probably have heard of Dropbox. Just Cloud is a newer one on the market. If you've got a lot of files that you want to put up to give different people access to, you can just leave them there. And you can use that for a personal backup, other systems like that. Here's one I do want to look at. If you can click on I Have It on the bottom, and I'll finish up with this. I mentioned this earlier, but some of the faculty and I at the university developed an I Have It. It's going to roll a screen right here. I Have It is what we call ecological momentary assessment. It's assessment that's in the moment. And this is an example of something that we were pretty particular about what we wanted to achieve. If you can scroll over that way on the page a little bit, we'll bring those iPhones into view a little bit more. There we go. But what we did was said, we want to do ecological momentary assessment, which is measuring how a person's doing around a specific subject in the actual moment. So what this does is it's an application that downloads a question pack. We've done this for College Church. They've used it for, I should think of the name of this, here we go, Soul Shift, right. And what we've done is said we're going to ask you a small bank of questions so that we find out how that's going for you in the moment. What we know about psychology research is if we ask you later today, okay, you guys are getting kind of overloaded today, I'm sure you're feeling that way, and more so by the end of the day, how was your day? Well, how do you answer that? If we were to ask you some questions right after this presentation about the presentation, you would answer that much more accurately. Well, over time, as you continue to do that, you can get a much more accurate read of how somebody's doing around a specific thing. And what we did was we used this to measure our freshmen on time on task, on a variety of things, and they found that the more we measured these and the more questions we asked them around their prayer life and different pieces of it, the more it actually began to shape behavior. right? So the fact that we were measuring it, the fact that we were saying, have you interacted with somebody lately? How was that interaction? Was that person somebody that you perceive as a mentor, et cetera, et cetera? We could build longitudinal data that really helped us understand kind of how they were doing through their experience in the college and through their experience in the semester. How their kind of thoughts and feelings towards things were changing, becoming more positive, more negative, those kinds of things. We've got some really interesting data out of that. But this is one of those that you can use. We've, again, used this for the soul shift dynamics. And it's one of the ways that we've said this could be a really good tool for our parishioners after we preach. My subject this week is on grace. All through the week, you could be answering questions. Have you extended grace to people? How have you extended grace to people? This application prompts them throughout the day, depending on how many times you want to do it, 2 or 3 times, and just ask them those questions in the moment. And it begins to create an awareness level that they've never had before. So that's a specific kind of an application around an effort that we're making. We started out as researchers kind of saying we want to have a better measure, and we think that we can utilize something like this. But it also begins to take us a lot of different places and has a lot of different options because of the flexibility of how we designed this and how we developed it. So it's unique. You can see up there the URL for that is emaresearch.org. And we've started some different verticals with this in terms of with spiritual formation and that kind of thing, as well as with some of the psychology research that we're doing, as well as the student formation and the different dynamics there. So that's kind of a run through of all the different pieces. In fact, I think if you go one more slide, I think that was it. We had high habit on the end. Yeah.